Okay. Is this working? We're good? Excellent. All right, just have to figure out this thing for a second. Hello, everybody. I feel quite lucky to be here. I think this all started with a whiskey and a cigar with Johan somewhere in Colorado. First off, I don't do very well standing still. Is it okay if I wander down there? I certainly would have been the one who was on Ritalin when I was a kid. That would have been my normal. So I want to ask you, just when we start, to think about your favorite thing that you did when you were a child. This is mine. It's not that complicated. I was up the creek. I'll tell you some of my influences while you're remembering that moment. So I have a strange background. My father is an immunologist. He's actually, if you look him up, he's known as the father of mucosal immunology. That's his Wikipedia page. So he was the person that, the whole gut microbiome and mucosal immunology and the gut-brain connection, that was his original work. So most of what we're talking about behind that's Dr. John Bienenstock. So I was the strange person who was told when I was a kid I was not allowed to wash my hands before. That was my normal. In fact, he did a whole video on this that he released just as the pandemic began that did not go over well at all. Now, he used to be, when I didn't know this, there's a doctor named Fraser Mustard, and Dr. Mustard wrote the earlier study. So he, in North America and in Australia, was the founder of our modern-day early childhood education programs. So I didn't know him as that. I just knew him as the guy who drank too much red wine at my house. So I was 5, and they drank an awful lot of red wine. He forced me into doing this work to build spaces for children because between the two of them, they knew that the spaces that were starting to become normal for children were sterile and that was going to cause damage. And so as a landscaper, they brought me into this. So that's sort of how all of this came together for me. So when you're thinking about your favorite space for a moment, I have 2 questions for you. As I said, this was mine. We dammed the creek behind the house, and we played in the water, and we played in the mud, and I collected fossils. My parents told me to stop because I had collected a metric ton of fossils, and they were in my bedroom on the 2nd floor, and the ceiling was cracking because it was built in 1860. So they said, you have to stop this now. So my question to you about your experience is how many senses were being hit in your experience? Mine was easy, all 5 of mine. So by a show of fingers, how many senses in your favorite experiences were being hit in your favorites? Okay, so you'll notice everybody, this is a trick question. Everyone's going to have 4 or 5. There's no way you're not because it's not your favorite experience if it wasn't a fully sensory experience. It's the way our brains work. Next question, how many of you had an adult with you in this memory of your favorite experience? Oh, there's 1. So, fishing? What was it? Swimming, yeah. So the thing, for those who have their adult in the picture, they were always encouraging risk. That's the normal thing for those of us who remember. My parents were not in any of my favorite memories when I was a child. It was my mom's job to make it a hostile environment, to make sure I was not spending time inside. Inside is where the chores were, outside was where you could actually play. We're seeing very different things. I don't know. There it is. We're seeing a very different childhood for kids. I don't remember any of this. I'm old, so I don't remember this. I am pretty convinced that the guy in the top right corner bullied me when I was a child. I don't know why I think that. The memories that I have were none of this. So average screen time before the pandemic in the US was about 52.5 hours a week of screen time for an 8-year-old. Average during the pandemic. Any guesses during the pandemic what it went to? 75 in one study hours a week, 95 in the other study. 95 was probably more accurate. So we're seeing this. The fact that there's a porta potty with I feel like I should have that here on the stage. So when we think of a space, we think about, okay, is there a space that is alive? Is there things that are alive in that space? And in the US right now, we're talking about 20 million acres of asphalt on our public schools at this point. It's a crazy number. There's a lot of paving going on. What I love about this is my son, Leo, up in the top right. So you don't know this, but he's invisible right now. You can't see him. He told me he is mulch. So I haven't heard a child say, I am asphalt yet. I haven't seen that as a thing. So there is something about having our senses engaged that changes the way we play and that we behave, and it fires up our imagination. And when we're working in schools, they find it very difficult for us to do this. I was asked the other day in Colorado, so what do we do to reduce the amount of maintenance that we're doing on our school grounds? And my response was, well, you do less maintenance. That's the way you do that. They did not like that response at all. They thought I was being sarcastic, which of course I am, but that's the truth. Teaching people to do less maintenance has got to be part of this so that there's more loose parts and pieces to play with. And yet as a standard playground, this is what we're starting to see emerge for the last 30 years. I love the fact that the sensory engagement is the smell of rotting garbage in the background, or it is the rubber tires which are off-gassing, or, so we have to do better than that, obviously. These little heat islands. And we're seeing fake nature now coming up more and more often. My father would tell you that there is no immune response to this thing, but there is to the heat, which is, 40, 50 degrees hotter, and it's inhospitable to those children. And we're seeing this idea of fake nature, things that look like nature, that is starting to become more and more normal for us. You can look this up, elephant pooping slide. You get to see all of the angles on this thing. That's not good enough. It can't be good enough. I think it's hilarious, but it's a cruel joke. It makes you question what the children are being treated like. So what we're looking for is different ways to interpret these things, and the natural things that are fully sensory do a much better job and are a little bit cheaper than this as well. So what do you see when you see that? I'm going to ask everyone here. I did a injury prevention conference, and the comment was they see splinters. So I'm asking you, when you look at this, what do you see when you see this? Anyone can answer. See a dragon? Yeah. A lion? A boat? Yeah. I can only see a schnauzer. That's all I've got. Now that I've seen a schnauzer, I'm stuck completely. I can't see anything else. And that's pretty normal. So the elephant, that's only an elephant. That is nothing else. And it's super important if we want to increase the engagement rates. Some of the research coming out of Tennessee right now is showing 3 times longer that the children will spend in the place if it's fully sensory and natural. So these are the common ones that we start to pick out of this that over the years, the schnauzer, like I said, is stuck on me altogether. I don't see the Chinese dragon at all. And there's lots of research, and most of us here know most of this research. The stuff in the US that I'm starting to pick up on, the diagnosis of ADHD is a pretty widespread diagnosis. So it turns out that in 72% of the cases where you've been diagnosed with ADHD as a child, in 72% of those cases, an hour outside in a sensory-rich area every day, the symptoms go away. In 100% of the cases, the symptoms change for the better. That's not to say that ADHD is not a diagnosis that we should pay attention to, but it's just that for a lot of our children, the majority of the children, that's an environmental cause to those things. And we're seeing these befores as a pretty normal before when we're getting into the same space afterwards for us. This is 3 months later, is a bit more rich. So we have a strange statistic. We've now been involved in over 3,500 playgrounds. So that's become we're our own unusual statistic at this point because we have 0 claims of injury on any one of our spaces. So, knock on wood, I know, I'm not Sharon just knocked to say if there should probably not go into. Inevitably, we're going to get sued. By the way, I live in the U.S., and so we're going to get a lawsuit someday. But we are starting to see a stat around this appear. The more sensory it is, it turns out, because I was involved in the systematic literature review on outdoor risky play with Alan Sandsetter and some people as a co-author. So without those accidents, it was strange. I got an email, when you look at your phone when you get the email, and it came up, and the title of the email said, "We're having more accidents." So I immediately phoned her back and I said, "Oh, what happened? I'm sorry. Can I come and fix anything?" And she said, "You didn't read your email, did you?" And I said, "No, I didn't. You said you're having more accidents." She goes, No. The kids are peeing their pants more." That was the accident. It's the best compliment I've ever had. They weren't going inside any longer. And when we did this work with another school, that's a pretty common thing, by the way. If you give a place of mastery for every kid, if you make it fully sensory, if you don't make it just about gross motor and large muscle, and you think of every space as to how they can touch and feel something natural, then you start to have much less injuries. They become more in tune with that moment. And if you look in the background of this, so we were very proud of the work. We had a fish spawning habitat that we built as part of it, and that was all accessible by the children. And 6 months later, we always asked the children, look at a picture like this. Where do you think that this is your favorite place? And more than half of them pointed to the forest behind what we built, not at what we built at all. At our best, we're trying to get past all the regulations in order to have a space that looks most like the forest. And that makes sense. It's where you can touch the loose parts, where you can make stuff, where you can hide, where it moves and is bouncy, where you can actually play in groups or on an individual basis, where you can become invisible. So not surprisingly, those are the better environments. And most of the things, if you ever come to our office, you will see on the big sign on the back wall burned into a big piece of wood, it says, "Grown-ups suck." We are the cause of the problems amongst those kids. If we could just get the forest into each one of these, we are much, much better off. The natural ways in which water flows is usually, for us, a way that we start our design process. So when we're looking at a space, we're trying to reflect the natural landscape that would have been here. This is the Mississippi River, a historical map of that. And we're looking at those natural arcs and movements to create weird little pockets and oxbow lakes. We're thinking about habitat when we're working. We're thinking about how to reflect those habitats. It should not look like everything that we designed out of Canada, because that wouldn't make any sense at all. It should be reflecting your local habitat. And that involves the microbiome as well. And when I was interested in this work, and my father spoke to me an awful lot about exactly the bugs that are in your gut, what I'm excited about right now, and a lot of these people are in this room right now, is that these different silos, scientific silos that have been around for a long time, when people talk about carbon capture, well, half of that carbon capture is happening not in the tree above, but in the soil below. It is in those bugs, that community of bugs that is living, that micro and macroorganisms below the surface that are doing significant amount of carbon capture. And so if you're interested in mental health, well, my father's stuff was around PTSD. His work around the gut biome and the gut-brain connection was, if you cut the vagus nerve and you have this community of bugs in your gut and it is healthy, then it is that community of bugs that's communicating through your mucosal system into your brain. And that community of bugs is the same community of bugs that is doing the carbon capture. So whether you want to think about this from a climate change perspective, or whether you want to think about this from a brain health, from a gut health, from an immunological perspective, one of the parts of his research was that a better predictor of type 1 diabetes than food when you're 30 is whether or not you were in a biodiverse environment before you were 8. So a better predictor of type 1 diabetes, how your gut biome is set up, how you're interacting with the earth, that gut biome is a critical factor of whether or not you're actually going to be healthy. And it is more about what's below the surface than what's above. And yet this is what we've been doing. This is my child, Leo. Leo is now responsible for 1 to 3 on the hopscotch game because the school community came in and decided this was the right place for the fence because they needed this much square footage, so they just closed it off. So I went to the principal of the school and I said, this is not good enough. And he actually turned away and walked away from me in my mid-sentence. And about 10 minutes later, he came back and he looked at me and said, oh God, I just found out who you are. You're serious, aren't you? And I said, yeah, we're changing all of this. This is not acceptable. This is all going to change. It took 9 years. My child was long gone from this school, but it took 9 years to work through the nonsense at the school board to get us to the point where we're allowed to change this for free. And that is a pretty normal battle that we've all been in. And this was their play piece in the middle of that space when we got there. One of the ways that this is where we started to count spontaneous social collaboration. That was our big thing that we're looking at. These are the number of times that children play with each other without any influence from any one of us, anyone else. This is them playing across culture, across age, across ability range, language, gender, without our influence. The more sensory the piece that they play on, the better our scores get. That is the best possible way we have to measure empathy amongst our children, that number of times they're doing this with each other. This is the space that they were playing hopscotch in. So this is now 8 years after we were finally allowed to make a change. Ironically, my son was on the crew that did the last fix to the space and added pieces into it. That phrase of less is more, in my opinion, that is a stupid phrase. More is clearly more. And when it comes to the plant material, when it comes to the sensory engagement, more is better. Constantly thinking, how do we add more to these spaces? That log that I showed you at the beginning, that giant log where we were talking about spontaneous social collaboration, this is what's left of it in the foreground now. So as it rots down, that was the big battle with our school board, was to have them allow us to have a rotten log in the space. There is nothing better than something that is rotting down. It is invigorating the soil, it is invigorating their gut biome, it is a science lesson, and it is so simple to do. But people are pushing back harder on this than just about anything that we're doing. They're now making that part of their normal practice. We're starting to see in public space a new age for problems with heat. The third time we got a report in the city of someone having a second-degree burn on their butt, we decided we weren't going to do plastic anymore. So we now have to shift the way we think. If we're doing a hillslide, it now faces north for us, away from the sun. And we're using the thermal composition of the soils behind by having a concrete slide. It allows us to actually keep it cool all day. We were working on a project in San Francisco, and we had a big argument about this. And since then, we have changed it from a metal slide that faced the sun, which they did against our recommendation, and now faces the other way and is out of concrete and isn't a problem. And the reason was that someone had burnt themselves on that slide. So I don't remember this being an issue when I was a kid. This is now an issue that we're having to face and think about. So some of the work that I think is interesting, Richard Liu's phrase, nature deficit disorder. So he'll even tell you that wasn't actually him, that was his editor that came up with that phrase. But the idea was that nature deficit disorder actually isn't a medical diagnosis, and he said this repeatedly. In the Helsinki Alert, this is a group of immunologists who got together. They got together specifically to say that this is a medical diagnosis, that they can prove now the cause between Crohn's and Crohn's rates, between irritable bowel disease, between certain cancers. So now we have to pay attention to that. My father was involved in the one below, and I was involved in the one above. I was only involved in the one above. I do not recommend, anyone here done a systematic literature review? Who's done a systematic literature review? They are tragically boring, no offense. It is agonizing to go through that process, but there wasn't decent data on how many injuries were actually happening. So I'm here to tell you the numbers for this. What we're finding out on the, whether you're talking about the Anarchy Zone or stuff in Berkeley or our work, number of hospital visits on a plastic and steel and rubber space, the number of hospital visits on that is 30 to 39 times higher than in a natural space. So we're talking about injury rates of 3,000 to 4,000% higher when we're going onto plastic and steel. In one study in Winnipeg, a crazy guy, Ron Blatz, he actually studied every single minute every day for every child in a 350-person school, and he tracked their movement in the entire space so he could tell you exactly where any injury happened per 10,000 hours of use over a 10-year span, millions of hours charted out. So what he figured out was they had a plastic and steel play structure inside, and they had exactly the same play structure outside. And the comparison between the two with the same rubber surface was that you were 2.5 times more likely to go to hospital on the one inside versus the one outside. So just the addition of the senses of wind and light, that was enough to change the injury rate by 2.5 times. That means that they were in the moment. And they were able to actually do better risk assessment because of that. And then if you go from there to an 1.5 acres of completely nutty, out of control outdoor space that was entirely non-compliant with every possible standard that was out there, that space, you were 30 times less likely to go to hospital as a result of that. So as soon as we light up the senses, everything changes. And the way in which they play changes. The other part that we're seeing when we're looking at our natural spaces is everyone has made a decision to make everything accessible to the top of whatever it is that we're building. And we reject that fully. We're not that interested. What you're looking at in the top left, that is older brother making fun of younger brother because younger brother couldn't get to the top of the boulder. And that is a good moment. That's actually something drives me crazy. I watch parents like lifting their kid up and plonking them on the top. That child is not ready for that moment. You need to actually let them figure this stuff out. And the stuff at the bottom on the right, you'll see that's Sam. Sam is so pleased with himself because he just stuck the landing on that 1 foot drop. Like, that's a big deal for him. He's done it. He was up on top of it. And in the background at 9, she was excited because she got the whole way across. We help our children way too much. On every play structure I've seen, they have a top tether that they're forcing you to not be in the moment or on the ground. Thank you. That's great.
Just water, no whiskey.
No whiskey? Whiskey is later. I'll buy the first round. And yet some boulders in Canada, this is what they're thinking of them. I love the fact that the rebar is at perfect eye poke out height. Or this one, the dangerous boulder. So we're seeing people far too afraid of these things. That was because they were quite sure that someone was going to trip and fall and hurt themselves on the boulder. But there are some places that are starting to take risks. There are some people starting to pay attention to some of the research that says if it's natural and it's sensory, they become remarkably good at assessing risk. So this is in Fairchild Tropical Museum in near Miami. We have 3 different children. These are the grandchildren of the funder that he was experimenting on to see whether or not we felt comfortable with this. I felt comfortable with this because I know if they're fully sensory and in the moment, if they're attached to it, if their gut biome is fired up and connected to their brain, they are going to be better at assessing risk. So watching this child be very nervous, we didn't see any of them run up one side and down the other side. The behavior was very cautious and at their level for each one, and 2 of the children absolutely refused to go to the top of the thing. When you're connected through your gut biome, through your senses, you become significantly better at assessing risk. It's actually, by the time we finished all the research on the 2,000 papers, it became super clear that you were way better off not making a perfect impact-rated surface below these things, but you were much better off at just making sure they were engaged with all of their senses as they were going to the top. Better than any of the regulations around playgrounds was the idea that sensory engagement made them better. And so a great example of this was a study done climbing pine trees, and the only thing they measured between the pine tree and climbing the pine tree and climbing monkey bars was the number of times the tongue stuck out. So, you know, this moment where you're looking at that thing and the tongue's out. So tongue out means it's a cognitive marker. This means you're in the moment. You can call that child's name out, and that child will not hear you when the tongue's sticking out. It's a big deal. Turns out you're 9 times more likely to have your tongue sticking out where you're climbing a pine tree versus climbing a set of monkey bars. The monkey bars are, you think about it, okay, first time you do the monkey bars, right? You've done that thing. Okay, so second time, now what do? I've done that one. Anyone been on monkey bars? So now you go on top. Yeah. Upside down, right? That would be the next one. For me, I was the bad child, so as I said, I was the Ritalin child, if they had any at the time. So for me, I was always trying to kick the person beside me. That was always my game. I'm way more mature now, so don't worry about the scotch tonight. I won't do that. But that's what happens if you change the sensory engagement, then you actually become more in the moment. Muscle memory is the enemy when it comes to thinking about injuries. Getting into that habit and having a non-sensory, repeatable thing, that's the enemy when we're talking about children injuring themselves. So the natural stuff is way more interesting when it comes to how they're going to engage in the space. Mixtures of boulders and logs. It turns out that the borders of these things are just as engaging as the things themselves. So we're thinking about the spaces where the greatest amount of living soil is, the greatest amount of microbiome in the soil is, and we're seeing consistently that is the thing that drops your injury rates, increases the amount of engagement amongst those kids. Sometimes it's as simple as just building a framework. So more and more spaces, we're just seeing frameworks set up and then allowing the loose parts to be there as part of it. These are provocations for the children. Very simple provocations are the ones, as long as you have enough loose parts, that'll actually end up in a significant amount more engagement. In cities where we're doing this work, we had one, they said, well, we can't put it up because if it stays up for more than 30 days, then it's a permanent thing, and then we have to ensure it is a permanent thing. So now they just pull it all apart on the first Tuesday of every month, and that's the way that they've solved all of their insurance problems. There's always a way to get around that. So now it is permanently impermanent is what they called it, which I like. It does not have to be an expensive intervention. I think, this was us when we met in Vancouver. It does not have to be a permanent. I found out later that this thing stayed in place for quite some time. We've done these temporary installations that become permanent when you start to put all the loose parts out there. The big complaint is that they're too messy. Children are messy. I was messy. I'm still messy. That's where the fun is, that's where the full engagement is, and that's where the best stuff is for them. So a permission slip for this exercise for us was, and you can see my friend John there. So what we're finding out now for the first time, there's a whole group of kids who think that this is completely irresponsible as a way to play. So our permission slip for coming in was to have a big mud section at the beginning, and they had to dip their hands in the mud and put a handprint on the grown-up. That was the permission slip. And as soon as they put their handprint on us, now you have permission to go inside. And they would hesitate as they're putting their hand on. Are you sure this is okay? It's parents that have adjusted the way they are. If you can intervene before the parents get too much of their nerves in here, they become much, much better at this kind of play. We spend the first 10 minutes of the exercise when the parents and teachers are there, physically holding back the parents and the teachers. And I do mean physically, like putting our arms out to block them. We have people that we bring along to physically block them and keep them in their pen to allow the children to find their place. Because parents will intervene and worry about whether Johnny is going to weaponize with a stick. The reason Johnny was weaponizing with a stick is because there weren't enough sticks, and he wanted that stick for himself. If you have 3-4 times the number of sticks that there are children, then you do a lot better. 10 times is even better. And when we're talking to people about design, we have stopped talking about playgrounds to these children. So design process, when we're designing space with children, that does not mean sitting in a room like this. The irony of this room, this is everything wrong with how we would teach, right? So the only two things missing are nature and children from this room, right? Sensory engagement is part of it. Has got to be a thing. So I've been eyeing these for the whole time. I probably should have put some of this on everyone's seat, because if you, when you get to this point and you're actually starting to lose it, a little dose of this would actually make a big difference. It works with the kids too. You can't ask them about their favorite experience if you haven't earned their trust first. So each of our consultations with children actually is about earning their trust first and figuring out how we're going to play. It might be fort building. A pile of sand is great. Get a group of kids to bury you in sand. The number of times I said, no, not the face. Just let me have my face out of the sand. So if you do this, you actually end up earning their trust, and then they'll tell you what their favorite experience is. And you see I'm holding cards here. When we're asking them for their opinion in what they love and what their favorite experience is outside, some of them might say some archetype like a tube slide, which I think is fun, but that's not really the point. The point is, why did you say tube slide? And 5 out of the 7 kids in this interaction that did say tube slide, when we asked them why, which we always ask why, they said, because we want to disappear. That is a more important response than the tube slide. So always ask them why that matters to them, and you will end up with something much, much better in terms of the sort of information that real feedback you're going to get. They didn't need a slide, they just needed a place to hide. That's all they need, and that's one of the key spaces in each one of these. So to give you a sense of what's happening in North America, at the beginning of the pandemic, I don't think you guys were nearly as dumb as we were in North America. So at the beginning of the pandemic, did you caution tape off in Belgium every playground? Yeah, you did that here too? I'm sorry. My dad was like the old man yelling at the radio. He was like, do you realize how bad this is? We're all going to be depressed in 2 years. This is going to be a problem for all of us. And I still think even now we're finding that. I will say this though, before the pandemic, when we offered up an outdoor space for free, just because we were interested to see what the marketplace was like, we had maybe 250 in a couple of months of offering it applications. So after the pandemic began, a year after it started, we put it back out again, and we had 10,500 applications in 2.5 months. So there is a significant shift in the way people are thinking about this. Who knows, we might even all be popular at some point soon. I think, we don't have to come here for our therapy of seeing the other people who believe in the same thing. So it's interesting to me to see how much popularity this is gaining and how little knowledge there is out there. People are weirdly freaked out about the wrong stuff. So we just finished one park in particular, to give you a sense of this for us. And they okayed everything. We had rolling hills, and we had pathways to go to the top, and we had a ton of plant material, so it was really quite full. And they came back and they said, we do have a problem with the pine trees. And I thought, pine trees? Really? And every time it's something, this one was pine trees, and it was the council and the Parks Department. And they said, I said, what is it about the pine trees? And they said, well, understand in Canada, the white pine is actually our national tree. It's not a maple tree. It's the white pine. So I said, what is it about the pine tree? And they said, well, pine trees have pine cones on them that are about this long. And eventually those pine trees are going to be really tall. And then the pine cones will drop and injure a child. This was their excuse for no pine trees. So they invited me to make a presentation on this. And being a flawed, sarcastic person, I didn't know what else to do. So I stood up in front of the town council and the parks department, and I said, I just want to thank you for pointing out what has been a national shame for years. The death by pine cone rate is something of a national shame. You know, the group of 7, our most famous painters, should have used a much safer tree as their muse. This is I'm really grateful to be amongst such smart people. And there's one counselor who's known me for a long time he was like this, you know, shaking his head. and I finally had to stop and say, okay, I'm kidding, and this is nuts. This is actually ridiculous. Obviously, this isn't a problem. Come on. And they didn't like me very much at that point. But they did allow the pine trees. But they came back and said, however, the crabapple tree has got to go. Because the crabapple tree is going to lean over the parking lot and it will drop on one of the cars, and that will cause a mess. So I put in a pear tree instead. That was my act of defiance. I'd had enough. So nice, big, juicy pears dropping on the cars is what ended up happening now. You probably should never work with me, is what I'm saying, really. It's funny to go to different places around the world. This one was I loved. So this is in Kings Park, which is outside of Perth. And I loved this thing because it was so nuts that out in the middle of the woods, this was their play structure. Now, their injury rates are no higher, and I asked their park admin person who was taking all the stats, like, how is this okay? And his response was, it's no problem, mate. It's human plinko. Does anyone know plinko, the game? It's where you drop the little things in and they bounce off all of the pieces and come out the bottom. So you're saying it was the human plinko game. You bounce off every single rope. So when you fall, you're really only falling from the lowest rope because you bounce off every rope on the way down. Well, it turns out, but that's one of the reasons why the injury rates are so low climbing pine trees, because if all the branches are there, you actually have a protective way of bouncing off on your way down, and the injury rates are remarkably low when you do things like this. Even if you follow all the rules, I just wanted to say this to the Americans. Canadians mature 6 months faster than Americans. Just saying. The laziest play structure manufacturer ever. I do love the fact that they couldn't be bothered to have 2 different signs. So, and I don't think that any of the 1.5-year-olds are reading this sign either. That's just I don't even understand the point of the sign when it comes to half this stuff. So, the more you challenge the standard around this, the more fun they start to play. I have been following and a follower of the European approach to not being prescriptive in the way in kids move through this. The idea of parkour has become more interesting to me. We keep our bark on all of these at the start. We were working with one school, and she said, about 3 days after we installed a playground, she said, we have a problem. All the bark is falling off. And I said, okay, what do you want me to do? She goes, I want you to make sure it stays on. And I said, well, that's not going to happen. So tell you what, why don't you just let the kids know that it's okay for them to pull the bark off, and then call me in a couple of days. And she phoned me an hour and a half later, and she said, okay, the bark's all off. So what was interesting about that is I got a phone call about 4 months later, and she said, I need you to bring me a truckload of bark. And I thought, okay, you're the no bark lady, what's going on? And she said, well, we have this problem because the children have used the bark as currency, and they have a bartering system, and they built a civilization around this bartering system, and they're trading pieces of bark, and each piece of bark was worth 1, so then they realized, oh, you break it in half, now I've got 2, I'm rich, right? Until one person said, no, 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 the big pieces of bark are worth 10, and then the whole civilization collapsed. So they needed more currency in order to have their civilization grow. But this is 6-year-olds who created their own civilization, their own monetary system, trading, bartering, and all of that did not come from the thing we built. It came from the loose part that we snuck in on its back. And a lot of the times when we're doing this work, we're trying to figure out how to sneak in the loose stuff, the good stuff, on the back of the other things that we're bringing in. It's a con, as far as I'm concerned, and that's a reasonable con to make, because a lot of people want it to be as clean and perfect as this. They will figure out how to play with the thing. When we built this for a school, they were nervous about the fact that some of the children were getting to the top. And I said, no, that's actually the point. The right kids will get to the top, and they will figure that out. And there'll be kids who walk to the top and leap off, and they are the right children to do this. And the ones that are below are the right children to be below. And even when we build really fancy stuff, and I love the thing we built in the background, when we do the pattern mapping, it turns out that stump, that piece of ecological restoration, because that's what it was on the list of items for the park, because I knew they couldn't say anything if I called it ecological restoration, but if it was play structure, I needed impact rated surface for 6 feet on all sides for 1.8 meters. So as ecological restoration, it was fine. More than half the children prefer that to this crazy play structure that we built in the background. It is not the stuff that we build that is the most interesting as far as they're concerned. And when we were off the coast of BC and we were working in a residential school space with the Kwakwaku, this as a structure to play on became their most important place to play. That's more significant than the play structure that we built in the background, was the items that we did the least amount of work to. Those pieces that are in their most natural form consistently get the highest numbers of engagement amongst those children. So when we're looking at a space, we tend to think of these things as places for sensory engagement for those children. If you're trying to judge whether or not you've done a decent job at a space, this is the things that you should be looking at. You should be saying to yourself, okay, have we done a good enough job on each one of the senses that we're hitting for those children? Oh, a fun fact, we tap maple trees. Do you tap maple trees syrup in Belgium? No? Oh, there's nothing better than making candy from a tree. So, but the thing you should know, maple sap is a stool softener. We did an entire class of this and discovered that's not such a good idea. So the entire class drank sap because it tastes fantastic. And that class lasted about 45 minutes more and ended badly. So don't get them to drink sap for what it's worth. As your taste one, maybe just a few drops at a time. So when you're doing these things, and you're thinking of those, you get the other ones. You get kinesthetic sense, and that's how your arms and legs are in relation to your body. It turns out that those get a lot better the more engaged your senses are. Sense of place. So a sense of place is, again, it has to look like it came from you. If children are going to feel grounded, are going to feel like this is an environment that they want to protect, then they're going to need to have an understanding of what's going on there. And the last one, which is why we do crazy things like flip a tree upside down, is because Sam, who is diagnosed with ADHD, stood there for more than 30 seconds perfectly still, looking up and poking at whatever he was poking at with that stick. That moment is something that we seem to disregard amongst our children when we don't do things that are fully sensory. So as much as possible, we try and make things weird. That can happen with a butterfly chrysalis, and it can happen with a tree that's flipped upside down. It can happen on a big scale. Children have a right to feel small against something big and to have a moment where they stop. So I'm going to tell a personal story about how this has affected me. Over the years. So at the beginning of the pandemic, my father turned to me And he said, because of this gut biome, and my father's work, by the way, he used to be doing work for pharmaceutical companies. Most of the immunological research out there is for pharmaceutical companies. And he basically got dumped by all the pharmaceutical companies because he figured out that the bugs that he was finding in soil had a better effect on PTSD than any of the current drug formulations that were available. So they dropped him like a stone. So then he got paid by the US Army because they were very interested in the fact that actually playing in living soils had a better effect on PTSD than any of the current drug formulations. And his work became really primarily about mental health and about stress and about anxiety and how that affected all of us. And I'm not sure if any of you are feeling this as well, but in the last 2 years or so, there's been a lot of stress and anxiety in our workplace, in our own lives, and I've been feeling a lot of this as well. He had said at the very beginning of the pandemic, because of the way we're reacting to this, because we're not spending the same amount of time in groups with our hands in the dirt, we're going to have an epidemic of anxiety disorders and stress that is going to hit us like a wall. And it's going to take 2 years for us to screw it up completely. And if we don't make that change now, this is going to cause a serious problem amongst people. We're going to see suicide rates higher than they've ever been. We're going to see stress and anxiety amongst our kids like we've never seen before. And he was right. And so 2 years ago, my brother and I, who grew up playing in that stream, the stress was too much for my brother, and he took his own life. And he talked about how he felt out of control prior to this. That for the year prior to this, he could not regulate his anxiety any longer, and it had taken him over. Amongst our children right now, they deserve better than what we did to ourselves during the pandemic. We do have a lot of ground to make up for this, and I've never really thought about the significance of that work, but it turns out that had he spent his time surrounded by people and surrounded by stuff that we all believe in playing in, likely would still be hanging out with them today. So I guess sorry to end on a somber note, but I just want to say thank you for letting me be part of a group that's actually doing the good work every day, because this stuff genuinely matters for our kids and for us. So my advice for all of us is that we spend more of our time out there too. Doing this battle has been something that we've all done, and I'm honored that I get to hang out with people where I'm not doing battle, where I'm just hanging out with people doing the work. So thank you. Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, I'm apparently I've got time. You don't have to ask a question. It's not required of us. Yeah.
Do I need it? Hi. How do you support the people, the staff in your playgrounds? You build these beautiful playgrounds. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I am now. Hi. I'm Kath Prisk. How do you support the people who
So the
are
staff?
then going to the staff, who are then going to support the children in these amazing playgrounds, who are a bit nervous about children hiding?
Yeah, so I think that the stuff that I just showed you is not worth more than maybe 25% of the marks on this stuff. So for us, there are 4 things that you require. You need to have, first, in order to be doing nature-based education, you need to have nature. So you need to put in some sort of forest that's going to be around for the next 50 years. You need to have features that they can be familiar with so that they have a place where they can do what they were doing inside, outside, and then start to branch out from there. But curriculum to teach, but the most important part of all of this is a mentorship program for those teachers. So what we've discovered is that when we teach just on their professional learning days, where we go in on that day and do one of a day of education, all the teachers love to hang out and play, and it's a fun day, and they go back the next day and teach exactly the same way they did before we got there. So the only way that we've figured out that works, we do that, but then we go in and actually take their class for them. So we spend a day or 2 days at the school And then we take their children for them, and they stand back and become the observer, and we show them exactly what that means in that space and how they can do this. So that most of the time they have like a fear. There's little Johnny is going to weaponize everything. And they have the name of Johnny or Susan or some child that's going to be a problem for them. The mentorship program changes that. They get to actually witness those children in real time. So if you take a whole class and have them observe, in the second half of the class they participate as teachers, that support makes them feel like they have a chance at doing this themselves. So I think the mentorship side of this is more important than any of the professional development. We didn't find that webinars really did much of anything except collect up people who already believed. And then the last piece of that is figuring out who the big advocates are in the school and spending extra time with them so that they could become the advocates from the school, not from the outside. Yeah. So it turns out to be the most expensive and least profitable thing about anything that you might do, but the most important thing that there's not much point in doing the rest of the work unless you're doing that. Yeah. We just spent 3 days in Colorado doing a workshop for the recreation department to make play and nature part of recreation, because up until now it's only been sport. So whether you're at a school or at a city, it turns out that, working with the programmers and the teachers is the biggest part, right? Yeah?
Hello, thank you. I am Julie. I was wondering, is it free for school, and then who pays?
And then who pays?
Yeah.
Oh, so many different ways to figure out how different funds for doing this work. The most successful program we've done is, because we're following the stats on each one of these, when it comes to the funding piece. Bullying rates drop by 87% when we make this transformation from asphalt to these things. Absenteeism amongst the teachers is dropping between 42 and 50% when they're teaching in these environments. So we've been working with schools on their budgets for substitute teachers, and there is enough money in just the budget for substitute teachers by dropping these stats that they are willing to use that money to pay for the intervention. Sadly, amongst a group of schools in North America, they're doing what's called a restraint room. So this is a padded room that the teachers need restraint training for their children to bring their children, when they're acting aggressively, into the padded room. And those padded rooms cost $125,000 to outfit. So when you can make a shift in that stat and they can move away from that thinking, there is some money available. It's been a bit of an effort to get people to think this way. We're also working, it's bonkers, right? That's a crazy thing to do. We can agree on this, and yet it's becoming normalized in a group of schools lately. So there are various other grants. It's actually easier to find money for greening than it is to find money for plastic and steel. And we're working with the government agencies, and there are some scaled things. We're finding it much easier to fund outdoor classrooms than we are outdoor playgrounds. So outdoor classrooms are an extension of the classroom and take pressure off. In the wake of the pandemic, we're finding that there are pockets of money to fund outdoor classrooms. We just build them so that they're playful. So there are ways of configuring an outdoor classroom that the children seem to misuse and play on them. So if that's what they want to fund, that's fine. We can do that. So there was two parts to your question, though, right? There was that one, and then, so where was the money? And was it free for schools? So was it free for the schools in terms of their use? So someone, for our work, we have a foundation called Renature. So we raise money for schools that can't afford it. I talked about those 4 things. We're finding that most of the schools that we're working on the for-profit business, most of those schools have 2 of those 4 things. They might have the environment and curriculum, and then we're providing mentorship and features, and that becomes, and that's usually money raised by family, by parents, by one advocate, going after grants and so on. It's always free for the student. There's very few programs. We are we're optimistic about a program in Canada right now, working with the federal government, that they're going to pay across the country for green outdoor classrooms. So we're working on that right now. But yeah, it depends would be the answer. It's not a simple answer. Yeah. I can repeat it.
Hi.
Hi.
In my kids' school, the process of turning the school ground into a natural place took almost 9 years as your kids' school. It was 7 years.
Yeah.
And a lot happened in the meantime. And when we ended up doing it, the children were different. And actually they were kind of looking at it as a strange place to them.
Right.
So many things were going on in all that time. So what I'm thinking, I wanted to hear your opinion. Should this be a process and not something that you should prepare and just put it there? Because you also mentioned that most of the times kids just happen to find something much more interesting than the things that you put there, right?
Right.
Should it be more a process where we could start and then reevaluate, looking at what the children were doing with the space,
Yeah.
and then betting on the stuff that they really enjoy and not the stuff that we thought they would enjoy? Would that be ideally the process of requalification?
Yeah, I think the process is the most important piece, and how you engage with those children. Even the language that you use when you're speaking with them and engaging with them, this needs to be a play-based intervention when you're having that conversation. We don't allow the word playground to ever be used in our consultations, because that comes with an archetype and pre-chooses and pre-selects what they've been indoctrinated to. So process is desperately important. That said, a lot of these things are being funded by a rich person. And we have discovered that the majority of those people are monument builders, and they want to have some monument, and the experience is very difficult to put their name on. So we usually, so our approach to that is, I mean, the gross motor piece, you're going to spend a ton of money on that thing that we think. The truth is, a hill and a really interesting border is probably as engaging or more engaging than the piece, that the ecological restoration work is going to be more engaging than that feature. But sometimes we're just placating the funder so that we can get the rest of the stuff for it. Ideally, though, yeah, we would have a longer process. We'd have a more engaging process. We would do the idea jamming where we're playing alongside them and the intervention is in their property. I think the worst processes out there are the ones where you go into a room like this and you get 3 dots. If you ever played this game and you get to put a dot on one of the images, I think that process sucks. Because now you're presupposing the stuff that someone else imposed on you. But if you ask a question like, what's your favorite thing to do outside? And you're having a conversation with the children, you can get to the core of what that cool stuff really is, and then you can design around that. And then the second piece is, we're not looking at this as a product. This is a process that we're opening up. Like, this is a longer conversation. You're going to add stuff over time constantly. You want to get to the point where people are dropping stuff off and, oh, it's Christmas. Christmas trees start showing up on your spot. Like this, we're just setting up a framework for all of that, that this should be an ongoing engagement. And then the next year there's another engagement. And what are we going to do this time? And then classes take it over on their own. So yeah, I mean, process beats product every day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just curious about, have you ever had answers to the pool dream? Because, you know, they always mention pools.
Oh, the swimming pools?
Yeah, the swimming pools.
Yeah, I'm not doing swimming pools. There's my answer.
When you ask them back, why do you want a swimming pool?
Sure.
What do they say?
Yeah, because I want to go swimming. That's not in my repertoire of things that I can do. So I have a pretty. Yeah, I said we can put in puddles though. I can get you water. We can have different ways of playing with water, and I can make some suggestions about what that water might look like. We constantly create little spots where there's really terrible drainage on purpose. We get in trouble constantly for making that mistake, it seems. But that's an important mistake, so that when it does rain, there is puddles of water. In North America, there are very strict rules and regulations around how deep that water can be or whether it should exist at all. I would love to figure out how to defer them from swimming, but I think that's a separate budget. There's my opinion. I believe that's a separate budget. It's not my problem. Yeah.
Another question?
Do you also work with secondary schools?
Sorry?
Do you work with secondary schools with older children?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because the census are, it's a different way to work with, I think.
Yeah, the terrible truth is that after early childhood, as soon as children can read and write, they just start to put it up on a board, and they stop trying to figure out how the children are working amongst themselves. We do a lot of work. It's slightly different. We usually have them help us build as a part of it. A lot more success when we're making that build process part of the intervention. So we're actually creating, as part of the consultation, we're creating teams that are going to help to install their ideas on the site. We get a lot more success when we're doing that with the secondary schools. There's distinct groups in secondary schools that already have an environmental focus. So working in their classes where they're doing that work as part of the consultation, so we're picking plant material. So when I started this work, my wife and I were talking to each other, and we said, we need to be able to look our children in the eye when they turn 14, because there's going to be a moment where they're going to say, what the hell did you do? Your generation has screwed all of this up. And I need to have a reasonable answer for him. There is an amazing engagement. On his 14th birthday, we gave him a camera, and he turned the camera on to me, and he asked me, so what did you guys do? Your generation sucks. And I was able to look him in the eye and say everything I possibly can. But there is an engagement amongst this group who want to be involved in the solution. I was horrified because I'm a horticulturalist. So over the last few years, we can't just plant indigenous plant material the same way we used to. Now we have to look at, okay, this is what traditionally would have been indigenous plant material here, and then look to where it's going to be 2 degrees warmer right now, and look at the crossover species, and then only plant the things that are on both lists. And for me, I see that as a tragedy. And the first time I was with a secondary school and we had that conversation, their response was, this is so cool. Like, this is how we can actually do this. So that new skill, and to figure out that plant list, and to look on websites that show them what both of those are, and to figure all of that out, was huge excitement for them. So they've designed those plantings through that process. So yeah, it's a different game. It's a much more engaged group. So yeah.
Hi. So at the start of your presentation, you mentioned that you get the kids sometimes to point to the picture and say what's their favorite part. And
Yeah.
you said they often point to the forest in the background. So I suppose through a lot of the pictures, you're doing a lot of monuments, and you mentioned your funders, that's what they're requiring. But would the emphasis not like to plant forests on the school grounds, or how much of your work is planting forests on school grounds?
I would say 70% of our work is planting forests on the school grounds now. It became so much worse. You can't do this work unless there's a place for them to actually have an environment to play in, where that hasn't been thought through for what's going to be alive in the next 50 years. So that's a key point of engagement that we're requiring. In fact, we don't sell any of our playgrounds unless they are signing off on funding all of the trees for their space as part of it. We won't install just equipment any longer. We changed that about 4 years ago.
Great.
So for the schools that already have a forest, we still charge them a tax, and then those trees go to schools who can't afford those trees.
Okay.
So it's pretty much guaranteed that we're working on that now. Yeah.
Hey. Hi.
Last one?
I'm
Okay.
here.
Hey.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's really inspiring. And thank you especially for sharing the story about your brother. Most of your slides showed these spectacular, beautiful schoolyards in mostly rural areas, surrounded by beautiful areas.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about working in the middle of cities, in marginalized neighborhoods, in places that are not surrounded by those kind of environments.
So the one that I would say was not that
Your kids.
was my kids' school. That was purely an asphalt piece that we started with. So this one 10 years earlier was 100% asphalt. So that whole school ground, that's 10 years later on that school ground. And this is why it was so hard for people to understand, because an entirely paved area, it's very difficult for people to imagine that it could be an oasis. So a lot of the 9 years was convincing people that it could be an oasis in a pretty short span of time. We've worked in Chicago, in the center of the city, or along the Calumet River, in places where, the day that we did our consultation in Chicago, they set the new record for number of reported gunshots or shootings in any city in North America that day. You could hear it in the background while we were doing our consultation. And it was in an area where there really were no trees. And those the one area that we worked on is very similar to this now. I think the most important thing that happened in that environment, and those environments where they haven't seen this before, was earning the trust of the school through a process, earning the trust of the students and the teachers in the process. And there isn't a rushed way to do this. It's not a simple piece. You can't just say, I have a great model, you have an empty palette, let us, fix this for you. So there's a great phrase around this. If you do something for people, they will eventually think that you're doing it to them. So you have to do it with them. So the process has to be properly connected to them and starts by listening and having a series of meetings set up where you're doing play-based learning and you're intervening with sensory material and finding your advocates. I have never been successful. We've never been successful at imposing this on a school. So the process matters more than the product by a long, long way. So it took us 9 years of process to get them to say okay for free to do this, and now it's part of that school all the way through. People vie to be part of that school. Principals are vying to be the principal of the school as they retire out. But at the beginning, we walk into a lot of hostile environments that take us a little while to figure out our way. It always starts with a single advocate at the school asking for us to come in, and then from there, process might be short or long. Yeah. Process matters more than product, I think, is what I would say. I think, is that it?
We want to conclude.
I can talk to you later. I'm going to be here for a while, so yeah.
I have to let him ask questions.
Yeah, fair enough.
Just to reinforce what the guy's saying here, I've dealt with sites in London where there's 250 square meters for over 300 pupils.
Right.
That's a problem which maybe we can't solve like this. Maybe it's a political problem, but I'm curious what the response is.
I don't think there's any problem that
Sorry, it's not quick.
So my quick answer to this is this connection to nature thing is not a problem we have to solve. It's a solution to the biggest challenges we have today. So the first part of any process is asking them what their biggest challenges are. If it's bullying, we have a solution for this. If that's the issue. If it's stress, anxiety, we have a solution for this. If it's the teacher absenteeism, we have a solution for this. If it's play and engagement, we have a solution for this too. And when it comes to having the surfaces stay alive, yeah, it's going to have to look a little different. There are a ton of tricks that you can use to make these spaces sustainable, even when you don't have the really good ratios around it. We've worked in inner city in New York. We've worked in very tight spaces. You just have to think about the surfaces very differently. There's a whole technical side to that. I don't think that anything can't be solved, though. And I think that the real question you have to ask yourself is compared to what when we're having this conversation with them. People say no to this, and I always say, because they're worried about something, injury rates, vandalism, whatever. And my question to them is, compared to what? Like, how is that going today? How's the aggressive behavior rates going today? Where are you now? How's your bullying rates today? And if every time we look at it as a compared to what, every time we do anything, it's better than their rates. There are no worse rates than just a field of asphalt. There really aren't. So even if it's just a loose part play intervention, there's always a way to get to something better than what you're looking at. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adam. A round of applause for Adam.
Thank you. Thank you, that means a lot.